Welcome to the new year. This is Politically Unstable with Kelly Sadler, and I am joined by pollster John McLaughlin. Thank you so much for joining me. He's currently on the Trump campaign doing polls. I'm not going to ask you about your internal polls, but let's get started with a lot of public polls that have been out there showing that Joe Biden is losing support from his key constituencies, mainly among Blacks, Hispanics, and the youth vote. And we're also seeing some of that trend toward Trump gaining a momentum among these demographics that typically aren't in his wheelhouse. Why do you think we're seeing this shift in polling?
Well, it's because so many voters in the country think that we're on the wrong track, 67%. And we post a monthly poll that we've published for years. And we never had Trump ahead in the national popular vote in 2016 or 2020. It was always an electoral battleground state play. And it's been different ever since Joe Biden surrendered to Afghanistan. And you've got the majority of voters think the country's on the wrong track, 67%, and that's corresponds with a lot of media polls. And then they say the economy's getting worse, not better, where that's 2-1. And 84% said they've been negatively impacted by inflation, 44% to the point where they're having trouble affording basic necessities, which goes back to, there was a time I worked for President Trump for a long time. And there was a time that I met with him early February. We were going over a poll, and I said, "You realize 2/3 of the Republican primary voters want you to run again." And when Biden fails, those of us who are old men, I worked for Arthur Finkelstein, who was one of the pollsters for Reagan, and I said, "You realize when Reagan didn't get the nomination and Jimmy Carter failed, people wanted Ronald Reagan, and he won election in a landslide." And there's a Trump parallel where Trump is the leader of the conservative movement in the country. And, Biden, I thought he was going to fail. And I said to the president, and it was recorded in Woodward's book and Bob Costa's book, I said, when Joe Biden fails, there'll be buyer's remorse, and they'll want you to run again, and they'll want you to win. And that's exactly what's happened. I just didn't think Joe Biden was going to fail this badly and in so many ways and so quickly, where in our last national poll, Trump's beating him 47-44 to be an electoral landslide for Trump. And we were getting 26% of the black vote. We're winning the Hispanics 47-40. And there is a Biden 2020 voter who is now voting for Trump in 24, where they're about 5% of the electorate. Then there's another 4 or 5% that's undecided. So those polls that we model after the 2020 exit polls, there's 4% more Biden voters in that poll, and Trump is now winning by 3 points. So there's been a big flip, and we could get even stronger to the point where Joe Biden's now planning on taking on Donald Trump in a speech at Valley Forge. Really bad metaphor. George Washington was a patriot to this Trump guy, and probably in the State of the Union. But the general election's on between Trump and Biden.
So, I mean, the general election is on, but as been said before multiple times, polling is just a snapshot in time. It measures where the voter is today. But we've got 11 months until Election Day. So what do you think the major thematics are going to be? And do you see Joe Biden rebounding from his abysmal polling right now?
Well, our first objective, we're 12 days out from Iowa. So the Trump campaign is focused on winning Iowa and winning the caucus. And then we're another 20 days out from New Hampshire. So we got to win that. And then we got to win Nevada and South Carolina and Super Tuesday and secure the nomination. And Joe Biden knows that. So he's trying to maneuver us while he's, so he can strengthen himself in the general election. But in the process, he's going to continue these personal political attacks on Donald Trump, where, Joe Biden, in our last national poll, 69% said the indictments of Donald Trump, 69% of all voters said these indictments are political. You have 58% saying that Joe Biden is behind the indictments of Donald Trump. You have the voters saying there's a double standard of justice in the country, 56-36. You have voters saying, let us vote on the election, 56-34. They don't want the courts to decide. They want to decide the election themselves. And that's higher than our actual vote. So I would expect Joe Biden, when he goes to Valley Forge, he's going to continue these falsehoods and political persecution of Donald Trump, where he wants to make him the Nelson Mandela of America. He literally wants to put him in jail because Joe Biden's so corrupt. He knows he'd been in trouble if Trump's president. He also is behind knocking him off the ballot. I mean, those efforts to knock Donald Trump off the ballot are being funded by Soros nonprofits, and Alex Soros is a regular visitor at the Biden White House. So this is it's going to get more intense, and it's going to get more nasty from Joe Biden, and he'll
So, I
say
mean,
things that are
so
without account.
we're seeing it backfire against Joe Biden and the political persecution of Donald Trump among Republican voters. That's almost given him a bounce. However, when we go into the general, and I'm assuming we're going to go into the general with Trump, I know we're still in the primary season. There was a New York Times article that came out a few weeks ago by Celinda Lake, another pollster, a Democratic pollster,
Right.
saying that if Trump is indicted and is convicted, that in the general election, that's going to help Democrats because people will be turned off by the scandal. What do you make of that argument?
Well, that's sad because that's their plan. I mean,
Yeah.
literally, I do work in democracies around the world, and my clients in Eastern Europe from what were once captive nations while Ronald Reagan was president, they were satellites of the Soviet Union. They say this is what the communists did in 1947 in Europe. They would lock up their political opponents. This is what the communist Chinese do today. This is what Vladimir Putin does in Russia, and Joe Biden's bringing it here. And so it's really sad. I mean, I have great respect for Cylinder's polling ability, but that strategy to convict your political opponent because he's ahead in the polls, that's something has no place in America. And the last time, by the way, this effort to knock Trump off the ballot, the last time the Democrat Party engaged in that, it was Abraham Lincoln because he was in favor of abolishing slavery, and they knocked him off 10 states, and that didn't end well. So this is a really serious time and an intense time in the United States, where the average voter gets it. Our lives are not good. They were better off 4 years ago when Donald Trump was president. Prices were lower, inflation was under control, there was economic growth, we were coming out of the pandemic, there was optimism. And it's all disappeared under Joe Biden. And now we're in these endless wars where Joe Biden cannot stop the war in Ukraine. He cannot stop, the Middle East war with Iran, that they're using all their proxies literally to attack the United States. They're attacking our military on an almost daily basis, and we're not doing anything to respond. We're doing mere pinpricks. Which is way different than when Donald Trump was president, because, it's one thing if they don't like you, but it's another thing if these enemies don't fear you and respect you. And that's what's going on with Joe Biden.
So 2 questions to wrap this up, and these are more polling related questions. Do you anticipate the turnout in 2024 will be the same as the turnout in 2020, where we saw a record number of people get out and vote? And also, in 2016, there was this hidden Trump voter, people that went to the ballot box, cast their ballot for Donald Trump, but in polls would say that they weren't supportive of him. Does that voter still exist? And what do you expect for turnout come November?
The hidden voter still exists to some extent. And some of it was deliberate because in 2016 and in 2020, the media was underpolling Republicans deliberately. When you get a poll where Republicans are 14 points behind the Democrats, that's not even close to the exit polls from 2016, 2012, 2020. 2020 was 37% Democrat, 36% Republican. So I think a lot of the media polls have corrected for that because there's so much history and they don't want to be embarrassed again. The other part is your turnout is really hard to predict. I think a lot of it depends upon ballot integrity, where in Georgia, they changed the election law to require voter identification in the 2022 election for both in-person voting, whether it was early or on election day, and absentees. And what you saw was a big drop. They got rid of the drop boxes where they made them secure. They're in government buildings. They weren't being funded by Zuckerberg, et cetera. Where you saw a big drop in the write-in ballots in 2022, where they went from 1 million to 250,000. But still, there was heavy early in-person voting, and there was heavy election day voting. But it was all done with voter ID, so you knew you had an honest election. So I think turnout will depend really on is there voter ID? Is there ballot harvesting? I mean, the Democrats, what happened in Wisconsin with the people that were disabled, that weren't disabled, that were getting absentees, et cetera. We got to make sure that doesn't happen again. And but first things first, we got to secure the nomination for Donald Trump, and then we'll look at how states vote and make sure that turnout is high among people that are actually citizens, rather than have 8 million illegals. I'm sure the Democrats got a registration drive for them. So it's scary.
I know. Well, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it. And thank you for the audience for tuning in for this week's Politically Unstable. I'm Kelly Sadler. Thanks so much.